right, welcome everyone to another episode of Give Me Some Truth International. I'm Sil Michelin. I'm joined by Keith Pennywise and Stan Farmer. And our topic for today is give all your money away. So...
Seems simple,
right?
Sounds like the least popular bit of advice you've ever given. So.
Actually, when we started, as long as we got to make clear off the top, so we don't get any SEC violations. We're not talking about to us,
right?
This
Absolutely.
is not
No, we're not asking for anything. Also, don't literally give all your money away. But that being said, there are reasons why someone might want to consider giving a substantial portion of their money away. And maybe even there are reasons now why it makes sense to do it. So Stan, why would, let's say, a very wealthy family want to make a large gift now?
Right. Well, because there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. But starting next year?
Yep. December 2025.
Yes.
Yep.
That if you haven't strategically whittled down your taxable estate, there will be more taxes with death.
Potentially.
Unless
something
allegedly.
happens.
So let's just kind of step back so people are clear. You're probably seeing a lot of stuff, content, if you follow financial channels right now, that is going through and saying things like, oh, give your money away, or tax deadline. The things we read among financial advisors and financial planners are highlighting this kind of December 2025 date, because essentially what could happen is the current estate tax exemption amount.
Gift and estate
tax, yeah.
Is unified tax credit as well. It's not actually an exemption, right?
Right.
Is somewhere in the range of $24 to $25 million.
For a married couple.
11 and a half to 12 and a half, depending on where inflation falls currently.
Right. But you should say exclusion if you say that amount of money, because that's not the size of the credit. Yep. That's the size of the amount of money that where you won't pay.
Essentially, if your estate is smaller than 11 and a half, I think it is.
I think it's in the 12. It's
12s now?
Yeah.
It's in the 12s.
Inflation. So in the 12s, if your estate is smaller than that amount, you won't essentially have to pay any estate tax. So for an individual,
Correct.
12, 24 to 25 for a married couple. What will happen is it's going to reset.
Sunset.
Sunset.
Tax cuts delivered a few years ago, sunset.
It's going to reset to a number based on about half of that.
Right.
And And so if your estate combined greater than, let's say, about 12 million, again, these are all being adjusted over time based on inflation, cost of living. It is greater than 12 million for a married couple and 6.5 million for an individual. What will happen is, if it's greater than that, you will pay tax on it. But if you give it away in the next couple of years, if you lower your essential estate or your holdings to below, say, 6 or below 12 for a married couple right now, you're basically going to be protected by this credit, right? By this tax law change. And so in the next year or two, a lot of financial advisors are saying, hey, this is a real great opportunity to maybe put this money in trust, maybe give it to children, because you're going to be taking advantage of essentially this much larger credit, this much larger exemption, as it's commonly referred to, than you might have otherwise.
Right. So for the estate planning industry, this is like almost akin to like the consulting industry when we were in 1999, right? This is, the Y2K. Everybody needs to, fix their computers and adjust this and that, or the world's going to collapse. It's kind of like that in the estate planning realm. Like it's you can potentially, protect yourself it's like a 2-for-1 right now, right? And then there's at least a reasonable chance that your exemption is going to get cut in half after that deadline. So you get almost twice the amount of benefit by not waiting and making arrangements, so to speak.
Right. So in simple terms, at the end of 2025, if nothing else happens in terms of new laws, political decisions, then everyone's gift and lifetime exemptions will be cut in half because the 2018 era tax cuts will expire. Now, if you're an expat, U.S. expat, as many of our viewers are, this will impact you in the exact same way because you continue to be subject to U.S. gift and estate tax. So where I think a lot of our viewers need to be careful is understanding how, because of their cross-border tax position, it may be difficult or in some cases, impossible, counterproductive right? to try to follow what is increasingly becoming very conventional advice from a U.S. standpoint, which is to say, well, look, there's this potential deadline in terms of the reduction in gift and estate tax exemption at the end of 2025. So make a big, chunky, multi-million-dollar gift now. Put the money in a trust, give the money to your children, cousins, uncle, it doesn't matter, just get rid of it, yep. Right? So how would you think about it then as an expat, Stan? Maybe what would be some example of, cases where you would want to be very careful in following their right. U.S.-centric advice? Well,
yeah. I mean, so there's two main themes, and I'll briefly touch on both of them. One would be that, that advice for the U.S. person is, ultimately carried through with a strategy often because people might want to, still control that money, right? So the very popular way this is going to be done in amongst the affluent in the United States is going to be to create, some kind of, family, irrevocable family trust, some kind of legacy trust, some kind of long-term, way that this money will get spent down for, a larger group of beneficiaries, perhaps, right? So creating a irrevocable trust might have completely, horrible consequences in countries where, trusts are looked at the way that the U.S. government looks at, Cayman, hedge funds and, hiding your money, so to speak, right? Because they don't have a legal tradition of trust. They don't treat trusts well. And it might create complete tax nightmares that you can't get out of once you've done it because it's irrevocable, right?
And I would just say very quickly here, this is important advice as well. Even if you're in the U.S. but your children are elsewhere. Right?
That's another good point, right?
Because
if you've got family abroad at all that are part of the trust as a trustee, as a beneficiary, or the grantor, which would be the person who sets up the trust, right? And gifts into the trust. This would be a nightmare. The second scenario, or the second reason, would be if you live in a country that has gift taxes, mm-hmm. you need to examine what gifting tax implications will ensue in your residence country, right? So, or if you have children that, or whoever you're going to give to, if they live abroad, they may be in a jurisdiction where even your gift to them triggers the tax itself, mm-hmm. right? So it's not always the person, it's not always the giftor, it's sometimes the giftee.
Yeah, I mean, it should be clear there, the U.S. taxes the estate. Many places also tax the inheritance, right? And
right.
Tax the person who receives the money, and so that can become.
And the same during,
Yep.
gifts while living,
Yep.
right? Or but this is an important scenario, right? Especially like, if imagine this. Let's say, for example, that you're winding down a successful career in Tokyo, right? And then you intend to go retire in a more tax-friendly country. That deadline is approaching, and so you might, get some advice from your guy who's kind of, guided you along the way. And the next thing you know, you've been talked into, a very large gift to your children. Well, that's going to come with huge tax consequences that didn't need to happen if you were more patient and waited until you were actually no longer a resident of Japan, for example, right? So if you're in most developed European countries, Australia,
France, Germany,
if you're in
Japan. You really have to take into consideration, well, are there immediate tax consequences in my country of residence, or the country of residence of the beneficiaries of this strategy?
Yeah, because I think one thing that should be stressed is that even with this, possible halving in 2025, 2026, the U.S. has very high unified estate and gift tax credits. Even you can give $15,000 in the United States, without any kind of reporting requirements. That's very high.
Yeah, the annual exclusion.
The annual
16
exclusion. Now. Yeah, 16 now is very high relative to the rest of the world. The other thing, as you pointed out, trusts are kind of a complication, but the sort of other thing that you need to be aware of as well is that the U.S. has estate and gift tax treaties with various places around the world. So it may work for you under U.S. to maybe give some of this away, but it depends on what assets you're giving away, right?
True.
And, if it's how the treaty treats that property. So it may be, we have a large piece of property. Yeah, that would be a good thing to give away in the U.S. because that's not going to be examined by the local country of residence. So there are ways to work around it using the tax treaties. But again, it's complicated.
There are ways to do it. You need to pay attention to these things, and you need to work with not just U.S. tax and legal advisors, but with residence country tax and legal advisors.
And we also, there are people in a number of countries around the world that don't have gift and inheritance taxes at all, or have gotten rid of them. So in that scenario,
some countries that will surprise you. I think of Sweden doesn't have an estate tax, which they tax everything else.
But, exactly.
Portugal.
Yeah. So it's not that uncommon. And if that's the case, then it could very well be that the U.S. advice is also going to work for you, but there's still a lot of complexity if you involve trusts and things like that. So you still need to be careful.
Right.
Yeah. I think the most common example of the complications of trusts is France, right? Because now they've just really, there's just a lot of paperwork and a lot of reporting, so that even if you're not having any adverse tax consequences necessarily, even if the trust is totally above board, even if you're doing everything that way, it's still going to be a pain.
There's still filings and disclosures to be made and things like that.
And probably really bad things might happen if you neglect to do those, I assume.
Yes. Not ideal.
Not great.
Not great.
Bad things.
Bad things.
So I wanted to highlight this topic because I think it's a good example of a situation where the right advice from a U.S. standpoint can turn out to be terrible advice for international cross-border families. So again,
and it's a mistake that, like, if you've made it, you can't undo it.
Yeah,
which is so it's potentially catastrophic advice.
Right, exactly, and the numbers are big, right? Because some of what we're seeing in the U.S., we're talking about millions of dollars being gifted and moved around for estate planning purposes, and it all makes sense. But again, look at your own cross-border situation and make sure it still makes sense. The other thing I would say is, there is still a chance that things could change between now and 2025. There could be new laws coming into effect, and it could go either way. Those tax cuts could be extended. It could be lowered back to what it was previously, which is kind of what happens if no decision is taken and just, we just default back to
the can down the road.
Exactly. That's just inertia.
So if you're betting that this problem is going to fix itself and your estate tax, your gift and estate tax, lifetime credit, exclusion, call it what you will, is going to, maintain its current girth, then you're betting on cooperation in Washington. You're betting on things actually getting achieved. I don't want to make this a political thing, but regardless of which person becomes the next president of the United States or whatever, I mean, it will require significant. It will require a majority of the House, a majority of the Senate, and the president to agree to maintain this current status quo. They will actually have to get it done and get it done on time, or else we will revert back to the essentially your exclusion, lifetime credit getting cut, reduced by 50%.
Right.
Right.
And so who knows? That might be the most likely scenario, but again, there are discussions about.
Always good when we just go, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are also discussions about potentially.
It's like Y2K. It's like another example. I mean, you're betting on it. You're betting on a scenario by investing. By engaging in a strategy and spending the money now to.
Exactly. I mean, and there are. Who knows, right? It could be back to like something that's just $3 million, for example. Yeah. So who knows, right? What could happen? And this is why this discussion, I think, is important. But at the same time, you have to recognize that it's somewhat speculative, right? You kind of go with what you think is the highest, the most likely scenario, and you try to hedge yourself accordingly.
Yeah. But an inevitability of estate planning, by the way, right?
Right, exactly.
Because you don't know when you're going to die. And you sure as hell don't know what the laws are going to look like when you die.
Exactly. Who knows where we will be 40 years from now? Maybe we'll have gotten rid of the estate tax entirely, right? So it's always difficult to make decisions, but it is true that a lot of practitioners in the estate planning field are now taking the view that this gifting strategy makes sense.
I think the general view would be for domestic folks, it's probably not going to get better, and it's a question of how much worse it could get.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to see coming out of this a negotiation to raise it even higher. Right. It could revert to this level, but if you're kind of playing the odds, chances are. The outcome is it could be worse. In that case, okay, then let's hedge, right? And
absolutely,
there are strategies whereby you can still have access to funds without, completely, kind of leaving yourself destitute. Because Syl and I were talking about this beforehand, and I'll kind of close with this. I think the story that I'm fond of thinking of is William F. Buckley's father made a lot of money as an oil wildcatter and set up the family, and his goal in order to escape estate taxes was to give away all of his money while he was still alive, right? Well, inadvertently, he gave away so much money that at the end of his life, he needed a home care nurse and couldn't afford it. And so the kids had to pitch in, and pay for the nurse, right? So, you don't want to be in that situation necessarily unless you have devoted children. I suppose.
Exactly. So
I mean, if you're married, the joint exemption will still be $12 million. So probably even in the United States, that'll at least buy you 7-8 months of home health care.
All right. With that, we'll call it a day. And as we get more updates on this topic, we might do another podcast and revisit this theme. But until then, thanks again for joining. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time for another episode of Give Me Some Truth International.
Walkner Condon Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walkner Condon Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit WalknerCondon.com.